Yeah, we have 16 on right now, so we should wait just a minute or two more. Well, I don't know, it's 10:02, we've got 18 folks on it.
Okay, so just a few more minutes.
Okay.
People to roll in. So if you've already joined, we're going to wait a few more minutes for other folks to join our conversation.
Yeah, so speak loudly, it's got to be close. You're going to put this one.
Okay. We're going to start at 10:05. All right, I think we're ready to go. All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Monitoring the Money, ensuring targeted services reach high-need students. I'm John Appel, Managing Attorney at Public Advocates, the Director of our Education Program. I'm joined by some high-powered panelists here in the Public Advocates recording studios. To my left is Carrie Hennell from Ed Trust West, who's been newly appointed their Deputy Director for Research, Policy, and Practices. Congratulations to Carrie on her promotion. And also Dave Sapp, the Director of Education Advocacy for the ACLU for California. We're going to be talking about supplemental and concentration funding and how to properly implement the law in ways that ensure the services reach the high-need students that they're intended to. We will be directing most of our comments toward our partners in the organizing and advocacy community, but we're also joined, we recognize, by members of districts and government, and we welcome questions from everyone. Our presentation this morning, briefly I'm going to talk about some the context, advocacy opportunities this year, as well as, and then we're going to have three different parts to our presentation. Dave is going to talk about how to fully account for LCFF funds in the LCAP. Carrie is going to address the LCFF proportionality calculation in Part 2, and in Part 3, Dave and I are going to tag team and talk about school-wide and district-wide uses of supplemental concentration funds, sort of permissible uses and not permissible uses. In each part, we will be stopping to take questions relative to that part before moving on. Invite you to use your keyboard to type in questions, and we will try to address as many as we can. All right, let's get started. So, what are the contexts for advocacy this year? There are at least three key opportunities for advocates to this year think about how to impact the LCAP template. First of all, somewhat unusually, this isn't going to happen every year, the State Board has revised the template from what was used last year, pretty substantially, as you know. So every district and charter school has to translate last year's LCAP to this year's LCAP template. That gives advocates an opportunity to help ed districts the opportunity to fix holes that were in last year's template. For example, some districts did not address all 8 state priorities. Some, as Dave talked about, we'll talk about, didn't address all of their funding under LCFF. Maybe they didn't hit all of the statutorily required metrics that we're supposed to set targets on. Those can be fixed during that translation process. And there is our new LCAP template, you see, which is reorganized around goal pages. Secondly, another key opportunity this year is the annual update. This is our first year of having an annual update. Districts, in reviewing what they did last year, also provides the opportunity for advocates to seek to have district improve, change, tweak, even throw out particular goals if need be. So that there's another advocacy opportunity in the annual update, as well as the opportunity, some of which we're talking about, in reviewing what the district did or didn't do and how funds were or weren't expended. But you also have an opportunity to reshape some of the goals going forward. And there is the annual update table. Finally, we've all had one year of experience doing this, right? So districts know better how to engage community stakeholders and know how to do an LCAP, and advocates know better how to engage in the process and have that community conversation. So this provides all of us more time and more of a sort of a second run at doing this. So let's take advantage and really improve our LCAP for year 2. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Dave then.
Thank you, John. So I'm going to talk about, at the very highest level, all of the funding, sort of the overall funds from LCFF. So we're going to hear more specifically later about the supplemental concentration. I'm talking about the full package of LCFF funds. And the issue here is that LCFF now represents essentially the vast majority of funding that districts receive from the states that's what LCFF was enacted to reform the way the state distributes money to school districts. So what we're talking about here is that the LCAP is the sort of universal planning document that districts use going forward to talk about how they're going to use those funds. And the issue that we saw is that in reviewing LCAPs last year, a lot of districts, and at least in the ones that I reviewed, the majority of districts failed to account for most of their LCFF funding. So in their LCAP itself, they only were capturing, in terms of the actions they were listed in the associated expenditures, a small sliver or slice of what the overall LCFF funds. And what this looks like is you can actually go through and add up each of the listed expenditures and get a total and then compare it to the total amount of funds that you know that the district is getting under LCFF, and that's what we saw was significantly lower. And there's just one example to highlight it. We reviewed 40 district LCAPs, and when we sort of ran the numbers, those districts received about $6.8 billion in total funding under LCFF. Then we went through and added up all of the different expenditures that were listed in those 40 LCAPs. And when you sort of totaled all 40 all together, there was only $2.5 billion in expenditures and actions that were showing up in the LCAP. So less than half of the total LCFF funds and what they would be, the actions they were being spent on were actually being captured in the LCAP. So why does this matter? Why is that a problem? And the issue is that the LCAP is supposed to be the comprehensive planning tool. It's what we're looking at going forward to help the district set the goals, and then from those goals determine what their actions are going to be across the 8 state priority areas. And the problem is that if the majority of the LCFF funds aren't captured in the LCAP itself, there are 2 distinct challenges. First, districts are going to be reviewing, as John noted, there's the annual update process that is going on this year that the district has adopted their LCAP, and then there are 2 years of annual updates, and then they're going to have to adopt a new LCAP after that. And the whole idea here is that districts are supposed to evaluate and do continuous improvement, assess what's working and what isn't. If they're only capturing a sliver of their education program in the LCAP, however, that's going to be hard. They may draw the wrong conclusions because they're not looking at the full picture of what's going on. The second challenge, which is a distinct challenge, is that LCFF is also premised on the idea of getting local community input from stakeholders, parents, guardians, students, teachers, other members of the community. And if the LCAP doesn't actually explain and give a full picture of what the district is talking about doing, what their priorities and strategies are, the input from stakeholders is not going to be meaningful. So the district doesn't get the value of that input, and also stakeholders don't get the opportunity to have a meaningful conversation about the district's priorities. The solution here is actually fairly simple, which is that districts must include in their LCAPs all of the actions, and then because they list actions, they have to list the expenditures that will help them meet the goals identified in the LCAP itself. So going back to last year, the State Board actually issued a guidance that hit on this exact point, and I won't read it word for word because it's listed on the slide, but the basic idea that the State Board communicated in that guidance is that pretty much almost all of the LEAs, almost all the district's expenditures should be captured because the 8 state priorities are very broad and capture the full range of the education program, so we would expect to see every action is actually supporting either one of the 8 state priorities or a local priority that's been included in the LCAP. Even with that guidance, however, we encountered the challenges that I mentioned earlier, where the majority of the time the full, less than half of LCFF funds were accounted for. This year, the LCAP template actually is stronger on this point. There are 3 important changes that they made that I think are very important for districts to really pay attention to these instructions, but also as advocates that we can point to if we're trying to ask the districts to do a better job of capturing the full education program in the LCAP. The first is that in the Section 2 instructions, so that's where the actions and expenditures are listed under the new LCAP template, there's a really important word added to the instructions to hit this point, which is that for each LCAP year, the district is supposed to identify all, and that word all is what was new, annual actions to be performed and services provided to meet the described goal. So rather than just listing an action potentially that supports a goal, the district is supposed to go through and really evaluate and think hard about what are all the things that we're doing that we think are actually going to help us meet this goal. For example, if the goal is to reduce chronic absenteeism, what are all the things that the district is going to do to try to improve that goal? So it's thinking much more broadly about the full program as opposed to just saying, well, what's the one thing that we're doing, which is what we saw some districts doing last year. Second important change is that in the introduction, there was new language added, again, I think to try to clarify this point, because all of us, including the state board, saw that this was a challenge last year, and I think wanted to provide more clarity. And at the very beginning, I opened this presentation by saying the LCAP is intended to be a comprehensive planning tool. I'm actually quoting what the state board adopted and wrote into the introduction of the LCAP itself. The idea is this is supposed to be comprehensive. It's not supposed to be just a slice. It's not supposed to just capture how districts are spending supplemental and concentration funding. It's not just supposed to capture one piece of the program. It's supposed to look at the full picture of what the district is doing to make it a useful tool. And then related to that, in the same paragraph, the state board also added a sentence that again, goes to provide a little more clarity and detail, which is focused on looking and thinking about how to describe and capture the basic instructional program in relation to the state priority areas as opposed to just the add-on pieces. And the reason, again, why this is really important is that what we saw last year is a lot of districts were basically focusing on what are the add-on programs that they're putting on top of their core program. But as a comprehensive planning tool, if we don't know what the core program is, if we're looking 3-4 years down the road, that maybe the outcomes aren't what we all hoped they would be based on the decisions that the district made, as far as the priorities and investments, if we aren't looking at what the core program is, if that's not even a part of the document, the focus is going to be what are the add-on programs. And the question would be, are those the right programs to be implemented correctly, when in fact the problem may be the design of the core, the basic program of the district. So this is a really important piece of guidance there as well. So really quickly, I think that there are 3 very basic questions that we can all, that we can ask the district that get at this point of underscoring the importance of using this as a comprehensive planning tool and capturing the LCFF funds more comprehensively. The first is, how much total LCFF funding is the district getting? So the districts actually have to know that because that's part of the calculation that they perform to determine what their percentage increase of services, or improvement in services using supplemental concentrations. That's one step of the formula that Carol will actually get to in a little bit. So they should know the answer to that question. Question number 2, how much of that total LCFF funds is actually captured in the LCAP? Or another way of asking the same question is, if we add up all the expenditures that are captured or listed in the LCAP, what's that total amount? And then the third question, if those numbers aren't the same or very, very close to each other, is for any difference between, the total amount that's captured in the LCAP, what's going on with those funds? How are those being used? What are they being spent on? And it's specifically whether for any particular use can also say, why isn't that actually supporting one of the priorities that's been set in the LCAP? So again, these are, I think, some very basic questions that I think it would be helpful for districts also to be asking themselves and going through the process, and that the state board in adopting the revised LCAP, I think, has really featured and made an important part of how districts are supposed to do their annual update and then also updating to the new LCAP template. So this is just sort of setting the foundation. The balance of the presentation is going to focus on how districts using the supplemental and concentration funding, the additional funds that they're receiving to serve the high-need students. But there's this bigger picture context of actually the majority of funds that districts get under LCFF are the base funds. And it's very important to know how the supplemental concentration are being used, but it's equally important to get an understanding of what the base program looks like, because that's often a key driver of outcomes, especially for the high-need students, because they need the additional services to the base program may not be meeting their needs. So I'm going to pause for just a couple of questions if there are any. Where are the questions? I don't see them. I see only polls. Okay, there are no questions, so we're going to move on to the next section of our presentation. So I'm going to hand it over to Carrie.
Okay, thanks, Dave. So I am going to focus us a little bit more narrowly on the supplemental and concentration funds. And specifically what I want to cover for the next 10 minutes or so is how the proportionality calculation, or the minimum proportionality, is calculated by a school district. And I'm going to actually walk you through that calculation for a sample school district and talk a little bit about what we saw during the first year. And then after that, I'll turn it over to Dave to talk about how those funds may be used. This portion of the presentation is really about how they're calculated. So first I want to remind everybody that when LCFF is fully implemented, this minimum proportionality calculation will no longer be necessary. Once LCFF is fully funded, once we have the revenues in the state budget to do that, each district will receive for every student a base grant, and then for every student who is high need, low income, English learner, or foster youth, they'll receive the 20% supplement, and for those districts with concentrations of need, they'll get additional concentration grants. But until that happens, which has been projected to be around the year 2021, dependent upon the economy, of course, we have this proportionality calculation. And what this allows districts to do is to calculate each year the percentage by which we need to increase or improve services for high-needs students, with that percentage increasing over time until they reach the ultimate target. And in some ways, this allows districts to phase in their funding and their programs for high-needs students, recognizing that they don't have all the resources yet, so that we're going to gradually increase the level of commitment that we're expecting over time. The calculation has 7 steps. I've documented them here for those who are going to be receiving the slides, but I'm actually going to move past this slide to walk through the 7 steps with a specific example. We're going to look at Fresno Unified School District. And there's a chart on the page here, but I'm going to direct your attention first to the right-hand side of the chart. What we're going to do is calculate the supplemental and concentration funding for Fresno, which serves about 66,000 students. 87% of them are high need, which means that they're eligible for supplemental and concentration grants. And the district received about $532 million in LCFF funds in the 14-15 year. Now, the first step of the calculation is to, I'm going to see if I can have this in here, is to calculate how much those students, those high need students, would generate in the LCAP year, so in the 14-15 year, if LCFF were fully funded. If we had all the revenues to reach the target set in the statute, how much would those students generate? And the answer in this case is $173 million. But we know that we're not there yet. So what we need to calculate is how much they need to direct toward those students in the current year. To get there, step 2 requires the district to look back year to establish what the prior year spending was for high need students. And the statute and the spending regulations specifically say that the district must spend in the 13-14 year at least what it spent in the 12-13 year on economic impact aid. This is a confusing point, but that commitment from the 12-13 year for economic impact aid essentially rolls over to the 14-15 year because the spending regulations were not in place in the 13-14 school year. So for prior year, what I plugged in here for Fresno Unified is the amount of economic impact aid revenue that they received, which was $22 million. Now, that's a little bit different from how much the district actually spent. And in some cases, we've seen districts, and Fresno is one example, where the revenues actually don't necessarily match exactly what the district said it spent on economic impact aid. So what I'm going to walk you through here are estimates. The district is going to have more precise estimates, but as advocates, this will empower you to be able to ask questions about where additional money is going and how the district arrived at its own calculation. Okay, so $22 million, that's the minimum that the district can claim for the prior year. Now, the district is also able to claim additional dollars, additional spending on high need students above and beyond what was provided to all students. And we saw some examples of districts doing this in the past year, and we'll talk about that. And John will talk about some permissible uses and some kind of questionable uses and decision points around that. In this case, we're going to work with the $22 million. The next step is to calculate what I'm going to call the equity gap. This is not language that's specifically in the regulations, but it's a good way of describing what we're doing here. We're subtracting the target, we're taking the target and subtracting out the prior year spending to get the difference, which is $151 million in this case. And then we're multiplying that gap times the funding rate, the LCFF funding rate. In the 14-15 year, the governor has projected that we'll be closing 29% of the gap toward full implementation. So what we're going to do is multiply that 29% times the gap, times the $151 million, to figure out what the additional commitment is for the district in the 14-15 year. We find that it's $44 million. So once we stack the 44 on top of the 22, we find that the district has a minimum spending obligation for supplemental and concentration, or for high need students, of about $66 million. That is the minimum amount that the district should be using or leveraging to increase or improve services for high-needs students in this year. Step 6 is establishing the base grant. So now what the district does, now that it's established how much is supplemental and concentration, it subtracts that from its total entitlement. This is the amount of LCAP funding it expects to receive, which, as I said previously, is $532 million, to arrive at the difference. So the difference is 466. That's the base grant for the district for this year. And the 66 million is supplemental and concentration. And then finally we arrive at the proportionality percentage, which is what we're trying to work toward with this calculation, and see that in Fresno Unified, the district at minimum has to increase or improve services for high-needs students by 14% in the 14-15 year. And because this is a phase-in, the numbers, those percentages are going to go up over time. The commitment is going to increase over time and fairly rapidly. Ultimately, this district will need to increase or improve services by 34%. So you can see that although we're asking for additional services this year, we're really going to be ramping up until full implementation. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we saw this year in the LCAPs and compare best practice to less than best practice. Best practice, districts should clearly show all 7 steps. This is something that we did not see in most districts, but we did see in some districts. Baldwin Park Unified, Buckeye Union, Albany City Unified, Orcutt Union Elementary, Pasadena are just a handful. There are others that did show all 7 steps, and that provides clarity to advocates and empowers people to understand where the money is going and why the district arrived at the calculations it did. Districts calculated the figures correctly and disclosed the total supplemental and concentration amount most of the time. Most districts did seem to compute this correctly and included that information in their LCAP. There were some instances where we found LCAPs that did not seem to follow the spending regulations. Marysville Joint Unified is an example of one that did not report the supplemental and concentration grants.
There's a question about economic impact.
Yeah. I'm going to pause. There was a question that came in about economic impact aid, and that's an important point, important question. Economic impact aid was a categorical program that existed before LCFF that targeted money specifically to low-income students and English learners. That money was consolidated into LCFF when the law was passed, so that program no longer exists. But it's an important baseline reference point for understanding how much we used to direct toward low-income students and English learners, with the expectation that we will only grow from there over time as LCFF is implemented. Thanks for the question. Okay, there were some districts that did not report their supplemental and concentration estimate, despite the LCAP's requirement they included. I included one example of a district here, Marysville. There are a few others that we saw. Advocates absolutely should be demanding transparency around that information. There were some districts, Oakland Unified is just one example, that reported the increase in supplemental and concentration funding, but not the total amount. So if we go, how do I go back? If we go back a few slides and look in the middle here, the $22 million is the base amount for supplemental concentration. The $44 million is the increase. In the case like Oakland, they only reported that increase, not the total. And the problem with that is advocates don't know how much is on the table for low-income students, English learners, and foster youth. Now, the regulation, the LCAP instructions admittedly were unclear about that last year, and it did include the word increase. So counties did approve those LCAPs. Moving forward with the final LCAP, the state board has actually clarified that point and made it clear that the total supplemental and concentration must be disclosed in the LCAP. Finally, the best practice in our minds is to disclose what was included in step 2. That's the prior year spending. And to make clear that that spending was in support of unduplicated students. This is the most critical step in the 7-step calculation because it's where assumptions can dramatically influence the amount of money available for new services. Most districts did not disclose that information. We found very few examples of districts that actually listed what their step 2 amount was, what their prior year spending was, and even fewer that listed the assumptions within that. That is, what are the programs and services that you're including? One example of a district that did is Los Angeles Unified. LA, to its credit, provided a great deal of transparency around what its prior year spending was, and that was really helpful to local advocates in understanding the proportionality figure. On the other hand, the district put things in that step 2 in the prior year spending that raise a lot of questions, specifically around special education funding. And what they did was essentially load up step 2. They created a much higher prior year spending amount than they would have arrived at without special education funding, which meant that the available dollars for new or increased services was smaller than it would have otherwise been. So the total was larger, but the amount that was kind of claimed by pre-existing services was enormous, and that left very few dollars for new services in that district. Specifically, this is an excerpt from the Los Angeles Unified LCAP, $450 million in special education funding was claimed as a prior expenditure that kind of took up that portion of the supplemental and concentration funds. And in fact, the district increased it to $475 million for the 14-15 year. There were other things in the prior year spending that seemed to make a lot of sense. English learner services, school climate services. But these are the kinds of things that we would suggest advocates look for to ask what is in your prior year spending, what are you claiming, and does that meet the test of serving high needs students above and beyond what's offered to all students? So some questions to ask your district. I've really covered some of those. One is, how much supplemental and concentration funding do we expect to receive? And how much more is that than last year? 2, what are the mathematical steps of the proportionality calculation? Demand transparency and clarity around that so we can understand the assumptions. The prior year spending, I talked about this a little bit. How did the district arrive at that number? What programs were included, and specifically which students were served by those programs? And a quick check, is that figure at least higher than 2012-13 economic impact aid? Some things to keep in mind. The annual update provides an opportunity to adjust plans, and there are a few ways in which, a few opportunities that we're looking at here. One is that the projected revenues that we've walked through are simply that. They're projections. And the actual revenues that districts and community groups are going to be looking at right now as they go through the annual update are not going to match exactly. And that's for a lot of reasons. The enrollment has changed from what the district projected back in July or in May. The demographics may have changed. The state funding estimates have also changed a little bit. COLA estimates have changed, and gap funding rates have changed just a little bit. So all of those things will affect the actual revenues. So be on the lookout for that. In particular, look out for demographic changes that could affect how much is available for supplemental and concentration funding. If the district's percentage of students who are unduplicated, who are high need, has gone up or gone down dramatically, that will affect the amount of supplemental and concentration funding. And knowing that these dollar amounts are moving around is important for assessing what the programmatic kind of what the implementation of programs has been and what's possible for the next year. Second, keep in mind whether the district actually spent or provided what it proposed to provide. So regardless of what the revenues are, was the program that we thought we would do a year ago actually put in place, and if so, why or why not, and what have the outcomes been of that? How effective have these programs or services been? And finally, how much does the district expect to receive next year? Looking at revenue projections for the upcoming year will help adjust plans and think about where we need to go next. The proportionality data that I just walked through is available as estimates for every school district on a website that Trust West maintains called Fair Share for Kids. The data that's currently on there is based on projections from last summer. So to the point I just made, if things have moved around in terms of demographics or enrollment, gap closing, those estimates will have changed, and we're working to update that data as early as today. But you can go to the site right now. The other thing to keep in mind with this data is it's estimates based on the assumption that prior year spending is economic impact aid. And if a district has put additional figures into step 2 and said that prior year spending includes more than just EIA, then our estimates will be low. But at the minimum, they're going to be a minimum estimate of how much is available for supplemental and concentration funding. In the case of Los Angeles, the figure that the district is using is much larger because of the special education amount. In the case of Fresno, which I just walked through, it's actually $10 million larger in the LCAP because the district is doing something that we can't see. while we know that the minimum spending for Fresno Unified has to be $66 million for high needs students, the LCAP is claiming $76 million. So I think it raises questions about what else is in there. So for those who are working in either of those communities, those would be questions to ask. Okay.
We have one question.
Yep.
Which was, does this, maybe just more just an issue is, does the state have a role in calculating the supplemental concentration? And then, but specifically that there are numbers that are out there like the LCAP snapshot,
yep,
the tool that you just described that Trust West has.
Right.
How do those relate to what the district is doing?
Okay, great question. The state, the CDE maintains a tool called the LCFF snapshot that calculates the district's LCFF entitlement. That's the amount of funding it's getting from LCFF based on estimates of enrollment, demographics, cost of living increases, and gap closing percentages, how much the Department of Finance and Governor are projecting to put into LCFF. So districts and advocates can go to that site to look at estimates for the entitlement. What it doesn't do is break down
the total.
The total LCFF entitlement, including base funding, including add-ons like home-to-school transportation and targeted intervention grant programs. Those are all in the entitlement. What the Fair Share for Kids tool does is takes that entitlement and breaks it into two parts, how much is base and how much is supplemental and concentration. The CDE is not making that information available. And in fact, as advocates, we've asked for more transparency around that. We would be happy to not be in the business of calculating this data if the state were to do that. Districts are going to have the best estimates based on the most recent projections of enrollment, demographics, and so on. So the districts are going to have more precise numbers than either Fair Share for Kids and Trust West or the Department of Education for the most part. So they're the ones to ask. What these other tools empower you to do is to ask the right questions and to have some baseline data upon which to kind of evaluate what you're seeing from the district.
And as you pointed out, Carrie, step 2 is the district's step to determine what's the prior year's services that were expended for unduplicated people. That's the one step in the 7 steps that the district has some discretion to adjust, and hopefully not manipulate, but adjust. And for that reason, the district has the best ability to tell you what's based supplemental concentration. And that's what they're doing with the 7-step formula.
And then just one final thought on this point. It took me about a year to actually fully understand wrap my head around what I'm about to say. The state is giving a single block of money that let's call LCFF money to districts. The state is not giving base money and supplemental concentration money as 2 separate grants. They're just giving LCFF. The district itself, through the LCAP, that 7-step calculation, is setting, while we're doing this whole phase-in that Carrie described over the next 10 years or so, however long it's going to take, the district is, through that calculation, says, of this total amount the state is giving me as a district, I'm counting this much as supplemental concentration, and the rest of it is base. So the district is actually, that is for lack of a better term, that is the only real decision about what the split of the total LCFF funds the state gives to the district. Of course, it's subject to county office review and approval, and then there's opportunities to point out mistakes if they've made mistakes or any manipulations along the lines that John said that many of us are worried about in some instances. But I think maybe one component of the question is trying to get at is does the state actually determine what that split is? No. It's the district that makes that ultimate determination through the LCAP itself.
And once we get to full implementation, then the state will easily be able and should be determining and reporting, this is what you got in your supplemental grants, this is what you're getting Fresno in your base grants, and the supplemental should be 34% more than the base grant. But it's in this implementation period, you really are relying on districts to report those students. Okay. Are there any other questions pending on this section? We do have another question on this section.
The total the state is giving the district is not a calculation based on the number of uneducated pupils. So how does the state determine how much money actually to give the districts? And that's, I think, the projections goes to maybe a little bit more.
I don't know if the question is around the calculation.
I'll answer this one directly with this one sort of through the interface, but then we can do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, we're on to section 3, which is the Dave and John tag team. Let me get my slide up here. Move this on. So we're going to talk about what are the supplemental concentration district and school-wide uses that are proper and not proper. And basically, we've set out here a set of 5 questions for advocates and organizers and district staff to ask to determine if proposed uses of supplemental concentration dollars are properly increasing or improving services for high need students. And the first question is, does the proposed use of funds increase or improve services for high need students? And that's the statutory language. The regulations further clarified that that increase or improve must be a, quote, must grow services in quality or quantity. So either you're providing more of something or you're providing something that's better in a different way than students in the base program get or students than you were doing in the prior year. Now it's important to think about this growth in quantity or quality along 2 dimensions, particularly during the implementation period. The ultimate way that the statute and regulations will function to increase or improve services is captured in B on the slide here, which is a growth over the level of services provided to all pupils. So in Fresno, 34% was the percentage that Kerry says they will ultimately have to be increasing or improving services in a way that is 34% greater than the base program provided to all students. And that's the target. Now, during the implementation period, we also have dimension A here, which is an increase year over year, as Kerry's slide well pointed out, while we ramp up to that 34%. So it's 14%, 14, 15, and then it goes up to 18 and 21, and eventually so every year there should be an increase or improvement over what you were doing last year because we're ramping up the implementation. So it's important to keep both of those dimensions in mind when you're thinking about does the service increase or improve some service for high need students. As I go through these questions, I'm gonna use an example of to play off against of a permissible use, and the one I want to talk about is a district proposing to add a high school, add its high schools counselor, extra counselors in order to address the disproportionately high number of dropouts among low-income students. That first question would be, does that increase or improve services for high-need students? The answer would be yes. They're getting more directed counseling services for low-income students in a way that is both greater than it was last year, and also ultimately would be over and above the level of services provided to all people. Question 2. and this is new in the regulations over the emergency regulations. Are the proposed use of funds principally directed toward meeting the goals that the district has set in its LCAP for students? The principally directed language largely came from the Equity Coalition. We recommended that be adopted in the emergency regulations. It didn't make it there, but ultimately the State Board did accept that language as part of the final regulation. What exactly does principally directed mean? It means in our mind that the supplemental concentration services that are being added need to have, as a forethought, the goals for uneducated people in the district. Not an afterthought, not even an equal thought. And I think that's maybe the biggest difference between LCAP's last year and the emergency regulations and this year, is that under last year, it arguably was okay for a district to say, well, we want to add technology for all our pupils, and hey, unduplicated pupils are part of all of our pupils, so we're going to use supplemental concentration funds for that technological addition. This year, they may still be able to add technology that is somehow equally accessed by all pupils in the district. But this year, the articulation must be much tighter and focused around why adding technology is going to principally serve the needs of high needs students. And if the district can't make that justification, then it shouldn't be using supplemental concentration funds for that purpose. So it may still be able to do the same thing or may not, but it has a higher sort of burden to justify why the that service is principally directed toward unduplicated pupil growth. Question 3, and then using my example of the high schools, I think that it squarely meets the test. If low-income students disproportionately dropping out, these counselors are going to be focusing their time on that issue and on low-income students, then that is principally directed towards the goal, even though they might have time to be serving other people who aren't high need. Question number 3, can the proposed use of funds be demonstrated as an effective use of funds for serving high need students? So this is also an addition in the permanent regs versus the emergency regs last year. And so the LCAP will have to have this additional justification around effective use of funds. And you should look for that in your LCAPs. Did the district explain why? This is for schools and districts of all concentrations. Why this proposed supplemental concentration use, the counselors, for example, is effective. And it might be because the district had past experience, or they've seen experience in other districts where that kind of program worked. There's research out in the field. It may be a theory. It should be a sound theory. But there has to be a justification. If the district can't justify why it's an effective use, then it shouldn't be using these funds in that way. Question 4 is particularly for low concentration districts or schools. That is, those districts less than 55% high need, or schools, in the case of a school-wide use, that is less than 40% high need people. And for those district and school-wide uses, the district needs to also show that the particular school-wide or district-wide use is the most effective use of the funds. That's a fairly high burden. Can be done, but this should justification. We didn't always see this last year. It should needs to be in the LCAP, the most effective justification, and the permanent regs clarify in the parenthetical there that those things need to be there. What alternatives were considered? What supporting research does the district have? What experience does the district have or can point to? What's the educational theory? All in a way to say that this particular, say, additional counselor service is the most effective use compared to something else. Question 5, it comes up this year and will come up every future year in annual updates and new LCAP adoptions. And it's a two-parter. And this is a look-back question, right? Did the investment in additional counselors or technology for all students across the district, did that result in an increase or improvement in services for unduplicated people, as promised? Now, sometimes it might be the case that doesn't happen. And you can look and see, well, actually, the way that the counseling program was implemented, they ended up serving mostly or equally high-need, non-high-need students. So it really was more a base program. It wasn't a supplemental program over and above the base program. So the way you're implementing this needs to change, and you really need to focus these counselors on our high-need students, or count it in your base funds and do something else with your supplemental funds. Secondly, in the look back, you now have this question of, was the supplemental concentration use effective in improving outcomes? And even if it met every other standard that we've discussed so far, if in fact you can show that the district's hoped for reasoning that this was going to be effective in improving, decreasing dropout rates for low-income students. If it didn't really work, if dropout rates are going getting worse, then the district really should advocate, and the district staff should agree that we need to do something else with our supplemental concentration funds that is going to be more effective, or at least somehow effective in hitting those targets. Dave is now going to give another example of, should I go back to the first slide? Of how to walk through these questions with the very common proposed use that we saw this year, which was with proposed salary increases.
So John, in sort of going through the questions, John touched on two examples that are probably, in those circumstances, going to be easy to justify. If assuming the district makes the showing and makes the argument that there are obvious, sound ways that the district can make the showing and answer each of the questions going through, and that way is having counselors particularly focus on dropout rates if we know that there's a huge disparity in outcomes for the high-need student groups, or district-wide technology upgrades. So this next example about future salary increases falls into the category of it is not audit, like there's some uses that we can say, and John will actually cover one of them, I think, which are, we can say there's just no way a district could actually answer, go through and actually make the justification for the program. The teacher salary, or across-the-board salary increases is not an obviously across-the-board can't do it. It's a probably isn't going to work in most circumstances, as I think where we would all come down. But there is a set of circumstances, and there are showings that we can imagine that a district could make that would make it permissible to use supplemental concentration funding to support a salary increase. So I'm going to sort of talk or kind of explain what that would look like and what that showing would probably need to entail using these questions. But before diving into that, I just want to be very clear. What I'm talking about now is using supplemental and concentration funding to fund the across-the-board salary increase. Districts are completely free to use base funds for salary increases, and in fact, districts are receiving an increase in base funding. So I think one question that no matter what the answers to these specific questions are, a more general question is, why not funded through base funding? Because that's clearly permissible and appropriate to do. So the first question is, does the proposed use of funds increase or improve services for high-needs students? And as a general matter, paying more for the same amount of service, the answer is going to be no. If you are basically paying more for exactly the same number of teachers and they're not providing longer school day or as a part of that additional compensation, doing something different or improved from what they did prior to that salary increase, the answer is generally going to be no. That is not an actual increase or improvement. There is, however, a set of circumstances, and there may be some districts that actually are in a situation where there is such a challenge recruiting and retaining high-quality teachers that, in fact, the quality of the service that teachers provide due to the high rate of turnover or inability to fill vacancies actually does impact the quality of instruction demonstrably in a really clear way. And so if the district is able to stabilize and sort of either lower the turnover rate or be able to fill those vacancies, there can be an argument that it actually is an improvement of the existing level of service if they're able to make that showing. But again, as John noted, the key question is focusing on the high-needs students in particular. So this is one area where we know typically the greatest impact of teacher turnover and vacancies tends to fall in schools with the highest concentration of the high-needs students. So again, that can be a part of the explanation that we could imagine the district potentially giving. So just to be clear, in most cases, I don't think it'll be hard to say it's not enough to just say, oh, we want to recruit and retain teachers better. There actually needs to be without this increase, we actually can't do it. That would be a part of the answer to the question.
So Dave, what kinds of evidence can you imagine a district, should a district be putting forth to say, we really are one of those districts that the salary increase will be the key to changing our teacher quality?
So I think the one is actually showing specific, we have had difficulties, and so being able to say we know historically, so looking back historically at the rate, vacancy rate, the turnover rate, so I would call it the looking backward, documenting that in fact it is a high enough level of turnover or vacancies, and also a reason how that's impacting the quality of instruction. Second, I think the district also would need to include evidence in the LCAP itself that shows exactly sort of let's look at our actual turnover rates or experience levels or whatever it may be, and then look at the actual labor market. so it's not enough to say, oh, we have a high teacher turnover rate, we're going to offer a salary increase to solve it. What's the actual basis for thinking that a salary increase will in fact address the circumstances or the specific challenges in the schools they've identified? And then I think a third, and this is actually going to get into the final question of this, going through, is there's also a question of, okay, maybe you can make the showing, but if it doesn't actually impact the turnover rate by giving this increase, then having to make that evaluation. But again, we're talking about, in my view, it needs to be a very specific explanation and showing that talks with the actual data and actually looks at the surrounding labor market. So being able to say, for example, 10 of the districts right around us have, X $10,000 highest average salary. We know our teachers are leaving specifically to go there. That's the kind of level of detail that I think would probably work.
And they don't have the turnover rates that we do.
Yeah, exactly. So, but again, not a general, well, we have teacher turnover rates, we want to increase salaries because that'll solve the problem, because in fact that may not solve the problem. And so what is particular specific circumstances? So I'm going to move on to the questions 2, 3, 4, and 5, but just to note, I think most districts are not going to be able to get past that first question because these are very specific circumstances that we're talking about. Let's imagine that they've been able to put that information in the LCAP. That's not the end of the conversation. Second question, are the proposed use of funds principally directed toward meeting the goals that the district has set for high-needs students? Again, it needs to be specifically focused on the high-needs students. With this particular example of turnover, I actually think that this showing can be fairly easy, assuming the district has answered the first question appropriately, because we know empirically that this impacts very disproportionately schools with the highest concentration of high-needs students. So I think that's going to be a fairly easy showing that if the district can talk about, we know that we have instructional quality issues in these schools in particular, and they disproportionately serve high-need students. That's the type of explanation that I think could answer that question. And then the third question is, can the proposed use of funds be demonstrated as being effective? And this is new this year. So districts actually didn't even necessarily have to make their showing if they were above the 55% concentration. So this is additional evidence and specific information, like, is there actually a track record of salary increases in fact solving these problems at that level? What's the basis for asserting that this will actually work? But I think would have to be included, as opposed to another approach if really there are challenges in those schools of, well, why not just add more teachers, change the what's called the norm rate, the way that teachers are distributed across. There are other ways to stabilize and improve instruction potentially available that could be used. So question?
Yeah, kind of combining, we had a question come in about the timing of modifying the plans, and so kind of addressing question 3 and what will later be 5 about the annual update. What happens when a district sees, it's not changing the teacher quality? The retention isn't changing, or we're not getting more experienced teachers. But so how long do you go on with the experiment till you realize it's not effective? Therefore, I'm not meeting the standards for what's required for supplemental concentration. And then what do you do?
Right. So I don't know that there's a hard and fast rule of 2 years, 3 years, 4 years necessarily. I would say 1 year is almost never enough to really see if something's going to work. That there could be so many variables involved. But I do think that that's actually exactly what the annual update process. There are questions the district should be, as a part of the annual update, they actually are prompted to specifically address in the annual update. So they would be looking to the goal in the LCAP that they believe this action is helping to advance for high-need students. That's where this inquiry would need to take place, is let's look at that goal and ask, are we meeting our goal? Are we making the progress that we think is necessary to reach the actual goal over the LCAP 3-year cycle?
Have we reduced retention or increased retention in those high-need concentrated schools, or increased the average teacher experience in high-need concentrated?
Correct. Yeah. Exactly. And if the answer is no, then the question is, well, why not? Is it, or did we implement the program ineffectively? Maybe we just haven't gotten the, I mean, it could be that it's not, again, this is where the reason could be, it may be an effective strategy, it's not being implemented well, like maybe they aren't getting the word out, maybe they aren't doing the recruitment the right way. But that's what the annual update process is actually supposed to result in, is let's understand if we aren't getting, we made a choice to use this strategy. If after a couple of years we see we're not moving the dial at all, let's understand why, and if it's the strategy that's the problem, or we just maybe are implementing it correctly, or something else that's going on.
But at some point, districts or advocates can continue to revisit this and say, look, it's been 3 years, it's been 4 years,
it's not
your salary increase using supplemental concentration fund for salary has not increased to improve the quality of teachers in our schools. So therefore, if you want to maintain that salary increase, you got to use base funds for it. Or, they're probably not going to revoke a salary increase. So basically, that's, in a salary situation, it's probably the district's option, right? And free up that supplemental concentration spending in some other year.
Right. And so I'm going to move through the last 2 questions fairly quick, because again, I think this is a very small universe where this even becomes relevant here. Question 4 is, we're talking about the ones that are below the concentration threshold. So the question is the salary increase in fact the most effective use of funds? I don't think the answer is ever going to be yes to that one. So I think we're talking only about school districts, but in the realm of where this may even possibly be justifiable, that are well above the concentration threshold, because if they're below, there are plenty of other approaches that need to be targeted. For example, pay teachers in those schools in particular. That would be
or for a longer day in those schools.
So that's a pretty, I think, straightforward one. And then this again gets to every year the district's supposed to be looking back and saying, is this working? And at a certain point in as advocates, we can all be asking, hey, you said this was going to happen, the dial isn't moving, why not? And then eventually you need to change course.
All right. All right, we have a question that's come in.
Mm-hmm. The County of Education approved LCAPs. How prepared are they going to be in looking at each of the LCAPs with the detail all of you are addressing?
Well, I think the counties are taking their job seriously, and they are required. One of the three things the statute requires counties to do is ensure that the proportionality regulations are being adhered to. So that means all of the calculations are correct that Kerry laid out, and it means that all of the justifications required by the regs, the growth in quality, for quantity of services, the principally directed, the effective, and in the most effective, in the low concentration districts, and now that we're doing annual updates, the requirements with respect to the look back. Was it effective? Those are all things that, in fact, the county is supposed to be making sure that the justification is there in the LCAP. And if the justification isn't there, then in other words, if the answer is no, then the district should not be proposing to use supplemental concentrating funds on that service. And it should either do something else or, like with the salaries, fund that with base funds and free up the supplemental concentrating.
And one additional point on that question also is that one other thing that the county offices are required by statute to be reviewing is whether the district is using the template that the state board has adopted. And some of you may be wondering, well, where do I find the information about this sort of justification? I just went through all of this detail that I think should be presented before a district could make a choice to use supplemental concentration, for example, on salary increases. That should actually be written into the LCAP. That's a requirement. The instructions are very clear. What used to be Section 3C of the LCAP, under the new format, it's now Section 3A. Districts are required to identify each proposed school-wide or district-wide use of supplemental concentration funding and include the required justification at that point in the LCAP. That did not happen in a lot of cases last year. In fact, very few LCAPs that I saw actually went through and made individual justifications using the standard that we're talking about, and those LCAPs still got approved. So I think that we know that the counties are also learning through the process, and I think everyone was learning in the first year, and this is something that we all want to and expect to see improve next year. But you all should be able to see in your district's LCAP, in the new Section 3A, for every school-wide district-wide use of funds, what's their explanation for and are they actually able to answer these questions?
Yeah, that's a good point. And the county, various county office officials have told us that they had a light touch last year in the first year, and it's going to be a somewhat more aggressive review this year.
And I think one of the things we did see is that the counties that were more likely to ask follow-up questions and press for more details were counties in which there was greater advocacy. Mm-hmm. And that's why the role of the organizations on this call is so critically important. Yes, the county has a role, but raising these questions depends in part on community advocates watching the process. It's arguable whether that should be the case, but in fact that's what we did last year.
All right, I'm going to go through one more example, and then we will open it up for any other questions that folks may have. And this is an example. You may want to move to Rigel, the camera, around special ed. We saw several districts use supplemental concentration funds to fund special ed programs. And in most circumstances, nearly all circumstances, we don't think that is a permissible use of supplemental concentration funds. And mostly, going back to question 1, it is not generally an increase or improvement in services for high-need students. Districts are required to provide special ed services for those students who qualify for special ed services. And they've been under that obligation for decades from federal and state special education laws, and they will continue to be under those obligations. Those are basically part of the core operating services of the district, and they're required to be. Now, it is true, unfortunately, that the federal government has put a lot of requirements on districts and only funded about 40% of what it should be funding under special ed. And so districts have historically had to spend a good portion of their general funds, unrestricted general funds, on special ed services. That's a bigger issue, and one that we aren't getting into today. We certainly support more federal funds in that area, but in general, it's not a permissible use of your supplemental concentration funds to try to cover that general fund expenditure for special ed. Carrie gave the example of Los Angeles Unified using, and let me say that, taking a step back, there are 2 different ways we've seen districts try to use impermissibly special ed funds, supplemental concentration funds to support special ed services. Number 1 is what LA has done, where they've said, that's part of our step 2 prior year expenditure. Because last year, in 13-14, we spent $600 million of our own general funds on special ed, and, well, gee, 75% of those students were unduplicated, so we were actually providing some extra services to all of those students, and therefore we get to count that as our prior year expenditure, the effect of which, as Carrie pointed out, significantly reduced in this year alone by $133 million what LA Unified is required to spend on, should have been spending on increasing and improving services for high-need students. So that is not, it's not a growth in service over and above what is provided. So looking at B there, the services provided to all pupils. Special ed services are provided to all pupils, and they're not directed like EIA was to high-need pupils. Of course, they're going to always be high-need pupils in your special ed program because they're part of your population. But it is a general service the district is under legal and federal and state authority to provide for all pupils. So it's not an additional service for unduplicated. So that's why we think it's not a permissible prior year expenditure in that sort of way. The other way we've seen districts try to get try to support their special ed funding, the supplemental concentration, is to say, well, in the going forward realm of we want to add, we know we're going to have more special ed spending this year, and so we are going to, for every new unduplicated pupil who comes in and joins our special ed program, we're gonna count that as an increase or improvement in services for high-need students. And again, we would argue that that violates A here because it's not a growth in service. That is a service that you had to give that student regardless of whether or not LCAP ever came along, whether or not you got any supplemental and concentration dollars, you would have to give that service. So it's not a growth. It's not an increase in the level of service to that student. And so you shouldn't be using these funds for that purpose. We've seen some districts say even continue or maintain our special ed program, which is a direct admission that it's not a growth, it's just a maintenance of the service. Okay, so so that seems right. Now, the one sort of sliver of possible permissible uses that we could see in the special ed arena would be if you added something that wasn't required by federal law, but you said, you know what, we're going to be able to do a better job of providing special, if we say added, you know, translation services for, we don't have a lot of English learners, but for those that are English learners we're going to add some translation services to make that more accessible for the student and for their parents and help them understand. That would be a very targeted use, an additional increase that you weren't doing before. Maybe you weren't required by federal law, and you added to it. That would be fine, and that you could do supplemental concentration services. Yeah, these aren't really relevant after that because you know, we've kind of said that that's the whole ball game is pretty much wrapped up in question one at that point. Finally, a few additional questions for advocates to ask, even if the district has met all of the legal standards and they've done a good job showing in their LCAP or the proposed LCAP justifications for the supplemental concentration funds. The conversation is not over there, right? I mean, and really the whole point of the LCAP process and engagement is to have a conversation with the district, and you should still obviously continue to say, well, wait a minute, even though you could do that with supplemental concentration, is that really the best use for our high-need students in the district? And maybe you could show, for example, if there were a salary increase, what's the effect of that salary increase on high-need students? And if, in fact, the most experienced teachers are in the schools with the low-need, you know, mostly, you know, non-high-need students, most of the dollars are going to go to those schools, and you could show that to the district. Wait a minute, our high-need schools aren't getting really very much because we have all these inexperienced teachers out of the salary increase. So maybe that's not the best use as opposed to a more targeted direction of, you know, extending the school day and paying our teachers at our school sites more, for example. And of course, is there an alternative use of the funds that would more directly serve and do for the pupils and result in better outcomes? You're always able to propose your own thoughts. Yeah. Okay. Do we have any other questions that are pending?
Yes. So there's one question that was asked earlier that I tabled until we have the broader discussion because it's I thought it was a really good one and it fits into all the different sections. And it was, what's the relationship in terms of funding that's not LCFF funding? Because districts aren't required, for example, to include funding that they receive from the federal government, for example, Title I dollars, or Title II, like the different federal funds, or local parcel tax. I mean, there are a lot of other funding sources other than LCFF. And how the districts approach that? And the answer is, I gave a preview sort of via the typing, is there's no requirement. It's not required that districts talk about all the programs funded from all sources in the LCAP. There is a requirement, though, that districts list all the funding sources for the actions that they've included in the LCAP. So even if it's funded from multiple sources, they do need to include what the amount is and from which source. But if there's a program that's funded only from a non-LCFF source, what then? And sort of what happens? And I think that the best practice and the goal here is that it's supposed to be a comprehensive planning tool. We don't want the LCAP to be totally divorced from some other plan that the district may have, for example, like it's federal funding that's right their own separate plan. And so the goal, I think the best practice is to incorporate and align all of those things together and put it all in one place. The state board and the Department of Education are actually working, continuing to try to work on some way to merge all of the different plans and documents that districts have to create, but that doesn't exist yet. So this is, I think, going to be an ongoing challenge for sort of like how do we help districts sort of pull it all together and know that a lot of districts are struggling with this. They've been the ones who've been asking the state board, please, we don't want to have to write 3 separate plans to make this all put together. But that was sort of the general question. I just wanted to throw that open before we get into other questions.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I agree that it's best practice to include more. One of the things we heard when talking with community advocates and parent groups this year is that it's confusing when there are multiple plans and when core pieces of the program are missing from the LCAP. Parents and community members don't think in terms of revenue sources, they think in terms of programs. And so they want to know what the program is, not the programs that are funded by a particular revenue source that really means nothing to them. So I think that's where the advocacy is really effective in demanding that the full program, including each additional service regardless of funding source, is included in one place, whatever that document is.
And sorry, just one additional point. Even, that's the best practice, is to have it all in one place. It is, in fact, the LCAP does, as I noted earlier, does require, if it's funded from multiple sources, but it's the same program, and it's listed in the LCAP, all of those sources should be identified. We saw that as a real challenge for a lot of districts last year. About a third of the LCAPs that we reviewed didn't list any sort information about where the funding came from. So that's something I think in year 2, again, we hope and expect to see improvement there as everyone learns after that first year. But I think that that's something you can also push for, is if that, if that information doesn't list, what's the amount and where does it come from in your district's current LCAP, to really push and ask and tell the district, no, you're actually required to include that. And if that's an issue in your district, you can follow up with any one of us and we'll be able to point you to exactly where in the LCAP instructions that language exists, but you can point directly to the LCAP instructions where it says, no, that's an actual requirement in the LCAP. Make sure you identify what's the source of the funding.
Yeah, and the LCAP does require that there be, and as does the LCFF statute, that there be an attempt to align the goals of the single plan for student achievement and the other plans from the school sites, the OEA plan with the LCAP, and the CDE, is working on how to make that better. So I think, yeah, in my own district, we tried to do that. I think we captured, a majority of our funds, but I don't think we got to 100%. And we did try to identify the other funding sources. And another thing we did, which I can't remember if you touched on, was many places in the LCAP, districts will repeat and duplicate the funding. And so you see $2 million for a particular remediation service under many different goals. Is that the same $2 million or is that a different $2 million? So when I'm adding up the supplemental compensation, is it $6 million or is it just $2 million repeated 3 times? So we noted this is the same as above. This is the same as above, and that really is the best practice, and it really ensures transparency in a way that's not confused.
Yeah, and that point's especially important under the new LCAP template format. There was a problem under the original LCAP template, but now it's actually going to be even more important because, as John said, the new format it's organized by goal. And very often, if a district has multiple goals, the same program is going to be supportive of that goal, but each goal is going to be on a separate page. So districts that should be listing the same actions, which have, again, which means they'll be repeating that action and expenditure for multiple goals. So I think that's a really important thing that we're all emphasizing is, this is best practice. It's really important as a best practice.
Okay, do we have any other questions pending? Okay. couple questions pending.
Should CAPs have comments on whole plan or just supplemental fund plans?
Should parent advisory committees have be able to comment on the whole LCFF plan or just the supplemental conservation plan?
The whole plan.
Yeah, absolutely the whole plan. That's what the law makes no distinction that parent advisory committees are empowered to ask questions and make comments about the plan, and the superintendent is required to respond in writing, and there's no distinction between the base funds or the supplemental conservation. Another question.
Can you give an example of when professional development may or may not be an acceptable supplemental funding source?
Yes. I mean, the easiest thing to think about is professional development to improve English learner student access to Common Core. It's a particular kind of professional development that's focused on finding students. If you want to do professional development on Common Core in general, as we so many districts want to do, you want to spend your supplemental concentration funds on that. You really have to meet that burden of showing why that's principally directed toward the goals for your high-need people. Obviously, if you're in a 95% concentration district, that's going to be easier than if you're in a 56% concentration district. And if you're in a 45% concentration district where you're below that threshold, you have to show why that professional development is the most effective use of funds for educated people. That's going to be pretty hard. I don't want to say impossible.
Yeah, we saw a couple of examples this year of districts targeting high-need schools for additional teacher supports, recognizing that to have the best staff in those schools and to retain staff, they need to build a more conducive professional climate, and that includes creating more time for collaboration, more time for professional development, and so I think that's a permissible use because that generally was in targeted schools. LA had an example of this, Fresno had an example of this. So I think that would be the 5-question test.
And just the final point is that I can't answer the question in the abstract because it has to be what they say in their LCAP helps answer the question. So I may think of an example of how it could make sense, but the district actually has to articulate that reason and tie it to their specific circumstances. So under that example, if they say, oh, well, these are the 3 schools where we know they're the highest concentration of high-need students, we know they're lagging behind on various outcomes compared to our district average, that's a great explanation. That would be a very, but if all they say is like, well, this is what we think is best for high-need students, well, no, that's not an actual justification.
And in the annual update, the community will be able to come in, and your own district staff should be able to come in and say, did that work? Did we serve our high-need people well with that professional development strategy that we improve outcomes? Next question.
Can districts justify using supplemental and concentration funds for school-wide programs in non-Title I schools?
Well, it would depend on the level of concentration in that non-Title I school, I don't want to say it's impossible, but you've got to be able to, and it depends on what the rest of the district looks like, right? I mean, if your whole district is non-Title I and that's your most concentrated school, yeah, that seems like a very good use to focus on that school. If the rest of your district is 70, 80, 90% concentrated and you're spending school-wide in a 5%, I mean, it seems like that's a questionable use.
And so we're almost out of time, and so I'm sorry if we weren't able to get to all the questions, but we just got a note from the wonderful people who really helped arrange this. So please email questions, follow up if you weren't able to get to it, and one of us will probably try to get back with those. And then also to please fill out, there's a survey at the conclusion of this webinar that is very helpful to know if this was helpful, and also what can be improved and how we can do this better going forward. Closing words, or we
I think that'll do it. Carrie and Dave, thank you for joining me, and thank all of our listeners for joining in, and feel free to reach out to us if you've got additional specific questions. And that concludes our work.
signing off from Public Advocate Studios.